There's been a sizable uptick in the number of homeowners now selling at a loss on the US housing market in 2025, and this uptick is especially big in certain cities across the US. With data from Redfin showing that San Francisco, Austin, Oakland, Tampa, and San Antonio are cities where over 10% of sellers on the market are poised to sell their house for less than they purchased it for. And if you change this list to people who bought after the pandemic, these figures jump to as high as 48% in Austin, Texas, 36% in Tampa, and 31% in Orlando of sellers now selling at a loss. And this marks a big shift in the US housing market because now that home values are dropping in certain cities, we're seeing more and more homeowners understand fundamentally that they are underwater. And I think an interesting question to ask is, what's going to happen in these markets where prices are dropping and where sellers are selling at a loss? Are we going to see more panic happen now from sellers in these markets? Well, to answer that question, a new article from the Wall Street Journal is talking about how homeowners who gambled on lower rates are now paying the price. And the gist of this article from the Wall Street Journal is talking about how a lot of Americans bought homes the last 3 years thinking that they could buy and then refinance at a lower rate. In particular, they talk about one couple in Ponte Vedra, Florida, who bought with a mortgage rate at 7.6%, but they were happy with the price and they expected rates to drop below 6% within a year. Then they would refinance. However, their plan hasn't gone as expected. Meanwhile, their home ownership insurance costs for the townhouse have risen. As a result, they listed the property for sale in March and cut the price in June. They're saying since we haven't been able to refi, it is not worth carrying it any longer. It's a bit disappointing. And what I think this suggests, everyone, is that we're going to see more sellers come out of the woodwork on the US housing market over the next 6 to 12 months because the payments and the cost of owning a home, they are stacking up. Whether you talk about people who bought with 7% mortgage rates the last 3 years or people who simply can't afford the property tax and insurance increases, you're seeing more and more sellers forced to list their home simply because they can't afford it. But to be clear, the percentage of sellers selling at a loss is still at a historically low level. Across the US, it's still only 6% of sellers are selling at a loss. You could see that's up from less than 2% in 2022, but you can see actually after the last crash in 2012, 63% of sellers in the US were selling at a loss according to this data from Redfin. And so we still have a long ways to go in the housing market to see like what I would call true seller distress. We're seeing maybe that seller distress crop up in certain markets, like in Austin, like a San Francisco, like a Tampa or an Orlando. But by and large, on a national basis, we're not yet seeing the seller freak out that we saw, say, in 2009 when that last crash really went into full force. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the economy, right? So the unemployment rate in the US is still 4.1%, is the official unemployment rate from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And that's still relatively low historically. It's up from where it was, say, 2 years ago, but still not at a level indicating that there's mass job losses across the economy. And so you have some sellers who maybe are struggling to afford their payments and who might be selling at a loss, say in Florida or Texas, but they might not yet be ready to really give in and cut the price because they still have their job. They can still scrape by and afford the payment. That's why when you go on Zillow, everyone, you see still a lot of houses that are really overpriced. For instance, this is a great example in St. Petersburg, Florida. It's a 4-bed, 3-bath that was built in 2023 that's listed on the market for $725,000. However, the really interesting thing is that this seller bought it for $653,000 from the builder in September 2023, and now they're listing at 11% more than they bought it for less than 2 years ago. Now, the interesting thing is that if you go to this zip code 33714 and look at the data on Reventure app, you could see the values are down 6.2% over the last year, and they dropped by 0.86% last month, which annualizes to over 10% in a year. So this is a market where the values are just clearly trending down. They've now dropped for about 11 months in a row on a monthly basis. And they're likely to continue to drop with the number of homes for sale in this zip code up to the highest level on record, and with the price cut rate also surging to one of the highest level on record. So for this listing in St. Pete, if I had to talk to this seller, I would tell this seller, hey, like, why are you listing 11% above what you bought it for, right? This is a market where prices have dropped 6% already, dropping even more on a month-over-month basis, where there's tons of inventory, tons of price cuts. But this seller just might not be ready to cut the price, right? They might just want to ignore all of that because for whatever reason they think they'll find a buyer at 725 grand, 6,300 a month. And that mentality explains a lot of the seller behavior on the market today. While we're in a declining market, in certain areas of the country, over half of the country is now declining in terms of value, you still have lots of sellers, even in some of the worst hit markets, who are still trying to get appreciation on their homes. And I think this is something that's kind of frustrating for would-be buyers and investors out there, right? Because it's like, you hear about the housing downturn, you see it happening on certain listings, you see the data, but then you still see so many listings that are overpriced. And I think you guys as buyers and investors, the way to handle these listings is to actually, if you're serious about buying today, make below asking price offers. In some cases, make well below asking price offers. If you're in a market that's declining, I would say do not worry too much about offending the seller with a below asking price offer. I mean, don't go crazy. Don't offer something 70% below their list price, but take a look at what the data in the market is saying and see if you can get a better deal. And what I think is fascinating is, again, how bifurcated this market is. Because if we go back to the Redfin data on the percentage of sellers taking a loss, and we start slicing and dicing it by when sellers bought, we can see 16% of sellers who purchased after the pandemic are now listing at a loss, whereas only 2% of sellers who bought prior to the pandemic are listing at a loss. So there's interesting dynamics at play depending on when a seller bought. So sellers who bought in 2022 and 2023, they might be some of the ones who are most hesitant to cut the price initially because they just don't want to go below the line of what they purchased it for. Whereas someone who bought prior to the pandemic, they have a lot more room to potentially cut the price. They might be more willing off the bat to just offer their house at a more reasonable price compared to market since they have so much equity. The other thing that's really interesting is when you sort these cities by the amount of people taking a loss who bought post-pandemic. In a market like Austin, 48% of sellers who bought post-pandemic are now listing at a loss from what they bought it for. In Tampa, 36% of sellers are now listing at a loss from what they bought it for. In Orlando, it's 32%. In San Antonio, it's 30%. In West Palm Beach, it's 28%. West Palm Beach is a market. A lot of people still talk about it like it's booming. 28% of people who bought in West Palm Beach after the pandemic are now selling at a loss. Fort Lauderdale's 27%. Dallas is 26%. Jacksonville's 26%. Phoenix is 26%. And one thing that's really interesting, everyone, is that this data shows actually still about how many sellers are stubborn. Because in Austin, if you bought after the pandemic and you're listing today, it should be 100% of people listing at a loss. Because the values in Austin have gone down 22%. It's almost impossible for you to have made money in Austin's housing market. But even in Austin, where the crash is most severe, you still only have half of sellers listing at a loss. And that helps inform you guys as buyers and investors how to interpret the market. That in Austin, where values are down 22% over the last 3 years, and where pretty much everyone who's bought in the last 3 years is underwater on value, still only half of those sellers are listing at a loss, which shows you that even as the crash maybe gets worse in certain cities, and maybe even still gets worse in Austin, you're still going to always see listings that are overpriced on Zillow. Like, that's never going to change. You're always going to have some segment of the market, some segment of sellers who are pie in the sky, who aren't ready to accept reality. You're just always going to have some segment out there listing high. And so I would just say, don't be discouraged if you're a buyer and you see those listings. Understand that that's just normal, and that even in a heavy crash market like Austin, there's still sellers overlisting their homes. Those homes just don't get sold. And the question to ask is, what are the prices houses are actually transacting at? That's the thing to really understand if you're a buyer and investor. What are houses actually selling for? Don't pay as much attention to what the sellers are listing the homes for. What are they selling for? Because I keep finding listings here in Florida where a house might be listed at 800, 900 grand, it sells for 700 grand. Or it might be listed at 400 grand, it sells for 320. We're seeing more and more situations where the seller doesn't want to advertise up front that they're losing money or going to take a big cut. But if you actually come in and make an offer and you're pre-qualified and you offer with the Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac mortgage, that seller eventually just might take it. Now again, there's big bifurcation in where sellers are selling at losses and not. We talked about Austin, Tampa, Orlando, San Antonio, large amount of sellers who bought after the pandemic are selling at a loss. But if we flip it the other way around, what are the markets where almost no one is selling at a loss? Providence, Rhode Island, New Brunswick, New Jersey, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Boston, Massachusetts. In Boston, only 1.8% of sellers are selling at a loss who bought after the pandemic. In Cincinnati, 2%. Montgomery County, 2.4%. Nassau County, New York, 2.5%. Chicago, 2.8%. So again, what this highlights, everyone, is the continued resilience of the Midwest and Northeast housing markets. We are not seeing a correction play out in the Northeast and Midwest, but we are seeing a correction play out in most other parts of the US right now. These areas in blue on this map are all seeing monthly home value declines. These states in blue are experiencing declining values. I'm going to talk more about them in 2 minutes as I wrap up this video. But first, I want to talk about some expectations to set in terms of what we're going to need to see in terms of home value declines and declines in mortgage rates to bring buyers back into the market. I think this is a really interesting topic because a lot of people in real estate debate, like, when is the market going to recover? When are buyers going to come back? Buyers have been on the sideline now for 3 years. What is it going to take to actually bring first-time buyers back into the market especially? And the thing I keep getting at as I look at this data is that we are going to need to see big declines in both mortgage rates and prices to bring buyers back in earnest, because the affordability metrics right now, everyone, are not good. The typical monthly mortgage payment in the US is over $2,800 a month, inclusive of mortgage, taxes, and insurance. That's over 39% of the median household income, which is a really high payment ratio. That's some of the worst affordability the housing market has had in the last 3 decades. And the target, folks, the target for home buyers to come back into the market and for prices and mortgage payments to feel more affordable is a 30% mortgage payment to income ratio. That's the target. That would correspond roughly to a $2,100 a month monthly payment. If we get to $2,100 a month on the monthly payment, I think a lot of buyers are going to come back in. The question is, what needs to happen to get us to $2,100 a month, 30% mortgage cost ratio? Well, folks, it would require mortgage rates dropping to 5.3%, and it would require home values dropping 15% on a national level. So if home values drop 15% and mortgage rates go to 5.3, we get just back to the long-term average affordability ratio of 30% mortgage to income. Now, say we want the housing market to get cheaper than that. Say we wanted to get to a 22% mortgage payment to income ratio, which is what it was in much of the 2010s after the last crash. Well, we would need to see a 30% decline in home values, and we would need to see mortgage rates go to 3.8%. And I think what this table shows you, everyone, is just how far off we are right now, just on a national basis in terms of housing affordability. Just to get back to normal affordability, we need a 15% price correction and a mortgage rate of 5.3. To get back to what it was before the pandemic, we need a 30% value correction and the mortgage rate to go to 3.8. So unfortunately, I think we are still a long ways off from seeing real affordability returned into the market. However, that doesn't mean that you as a buyer and investor should just give up on your search. I think you guys rather, if you're intent on buying a house, you should be diligent in looking for houses and listings in areas you like where sellers have cut the price and where prices are forecast to drop by more into the future. Because if there's downward price pressure, if prices are dropping and are forecast to drop by more into the future, you have a better chance of finding a seller willing to sell at a loss or finding a seller who is willing to give up some of their equity to make it more affordable for you to buy. And what we do on Reventure app is we offer all of you a home price forecast for the next 12 months that allows you to see the potential future direction of the market. You can see our 12-month forecast here for all of the different continental US states. The bluer the state looks, the further downward the forecast is. And we're seeing now certain neighborhoods here at ReVenture App, our forecasts are tilting down as much as minus 10.4%. Year over year is what we're seeing in certain zip codes around a market like Dallas. So if you're looking to buy in some of these zip codes, access this forecast. See where the data is saying prices are going to head in the future and start maybe adjusting your bidding and adjusting your offers to this forecast and bring this data actually to the seller. And one thing I'm actually really excited to announce is we ran some new data here on ReVenture App to test our score to see how it's performed over the last 12 months, and our score is performing very well so far in 2025. You can see that our score from April 2024 to April 2025 predicted price growth with a 72% correlation coefficient across metros in America with over 100,000 people. And I would really suggest, if you are a home buyer and investor, to access that forecast for your state, county, and zip code so you can have a better sense of where values could be heading in the future. You can access that forecast under a premium plan for $39 a month. Sign up for that premium plan today and track that forecast over multiple months to see where the market's heading and use that information to ultimately save money on your home purchase.